What is a histogram? Where do you find it? And once you've found it, what do you do with it? Okay, so in this video, I'm actually again responding to a suggestion. I've mentioned the histogram in quite a few videos, and I had a suggestion that maybe it would be a good idea to do a video talking about the histogram. So that's what I'm going to do. The starting point, what is a histogram? Well, a histogram is a representation of the tonal range of an image. So it's a measure of the exposure. And if you see a histogram as it's normally represented in a horizontal format, the far left hand side of the histogram is 100% black, completely black. There is no detail in there, it's just black. The far right hand side of the histogram is 100% white, completely white. There is no detail in there. And then basically moving from left to right, you go through shades of grey, from completely black all the way through to completely white. And if you have an image that has got a lot of dark areas in it, then you will see peaks or bulges towards the left hand side of the histogram. And if you have an image that has a lot of bright scenes in it, you will see a histogram that has bulges and peaks towards the right hand side of the histogram. If you have a very contrasty image, you might see peaks at both sides, so peaks in the dark areas and in the bright areas. And if you have an image that was shot in sort of fairly flat light with not much contrast, then you might well see a histogram that is sort of fairly uniform across the whole piece. The histogram that I've been talking about is the luminosity of the image, so it's basically measured in shades of grey. You may also see other histograms that are in colour, and we'll come on to those a bit more in a second. So what's the first place you might see a histogram? Well, the first place you might see it, not everybody will see this, but the first place you might see it is on the live view screen on your camera. Now, as I said, not everybody may see it here because not all cameras have a live view histogram. But that histogram is a prediction of what the image is going to look like if you take it based on the light on the scene at the time and the exposure settings that you've got dialed in. So let's have a look at that first. Okay, so I've got a composition dialed in. It's nothing special, it's more for example than anything else. And I'm using live view, I'm in manual exposure, and here is my histogram. And you can see on this one, I've got quite a big bulge towards the left hand side, meaning a lot of the image is dark, but I've also got information going all the way across almost to the right hand side, and there's a little tiny peak over on the right hand side. And that's because there's a lot of bright light coming in from over this side here where the sun's going down. So you can see here that if I change the exposure settings by shortening the exposure, therefore underexposing it more, that histogram moves more and more to the left. If I go the other way and I increase the exposure time, the histogram is going more and more to the right. So it's giving me a good view of what the exposure will look like if I take a shot. And that brings us on to the second place you might find a histogram, and that is on the preview. So if I take a shot now, here's my shot, and here is a histogram which pretty much represents what we saw. So my image is here, it shows my exposure details, and it shows a histogram which is quite dark over on the left hand side, but has information going all the way across to the right. Now there's an alternative version of the histogram that we might see, and here we have basically the same histogram showing effectively just the shades of grey, but we also have one which is showing the tonal range of the reds, the greens and the blues, so the 3 colour channels. So the final place you might see the histogram would be in the post-processing software. So here's an example of a histogram in Lightroom. And if we look a bit closer, you can see that this histogram has the greys, so in other words the overall luminosity values. It also has the red, green and blue channels, and it also has some of the overlapping channels. So for example, there's some yellow in there. So that is where you can find the histogram. But once you've found it, what are you going to do with it? Okay, so what's important to understand is that I am talking about shooting in RAW with the intention of processing the image. If you are intending to shoot in JPEG and not process the image, then the histogram becomes much less important. But for landscape photography, I would always recommend shooting in RAW and then processing the image yourself to get it the way that you want it. So, how do you use the histogram? Well, the first thing to really pick up on is that with a digital camera, when you take a shot, you're not actually taking a picture. There is no picture in the camera. All there is a load of data, a load of ones and zeros stored on a memory card. But those ones and zeros can be translated by software to either produce patterns of light on a screen or to produce patterns of ink on paper. But there's no actual image there. So if you're shooting in RAW, ideally what you want is the maximum amount of data in that file as you can possibly get, because then when you come to process it, you've got the maximum amount of information that the software can play with to get the image looking the way that you want. And the way that I shoot, and I know a lot of people shoot, is I maximize the amount of data by exposing to the right. So let's explain what exposing to the right actually means. Exposing to the right is about having the histogram going as far to the right hand side as you possibly can without it actually hitting that far right hand edge. Because if you hit that edge, you've got pure whites in there, you've got blown highlights, there's no data in there and you don't want that. So the idea is to get the histogram as far across to the right as you can, and that then will give you the maximum amount of information to play with. What you also want to try to avoid is having information jutting up against that far left hand side of the histogram, because then you've got pure blacks. Again, there's no information. So in an ideal world, you will have information across the range of the histogram, but as far to the right as you possibly can without clipping highlights. Now it's fair to say that modern cameras and modern software can recover an amazing amount of detail if you happen to stray into blown highlights or clipped shadows. In other words, if the histogram ends up hitting the far right or the far left. But it does so at a price. In particular, recovering highlights can result in unpleasant artifacts, colour casts, and all sorts of other things that you don't really want. So if you have to make a choice between blowing highlights and clipping shadows, clip the shadows, because in general you can get better recovery of shadow detail, and what you'll then find is you might get a bit of noise in those shadows, but in most cases it won't be that noticeable unless it's massively underexposed and you lift it up a lot. Of course, the other options, if you've got a scene which has got very bright highlights and very dark shadows, in other words very contrasty, and you can't avoid that histogram straying to either one end or both ends, is you can use filters like ND Grads to hold back some of the highlights in the scene and balance the image, or you can shoot multiple exposures. So in other words, shoot one which has got no blown highlights but has got clipped shadows, and then shoot another one which has got no clipped shadows but has got blown highlights, and then you can merge those in software. And it's normally a good idea to take one in the middle as well, just to make sure that everything's nicely balanced out. And you can merge those really easily in most cases in something like Lightroom. When I was shooting that video, I had to kind of have the camera in a less than ideal position for this composition, because otherwise there was glare hitting the screen and I couldn't video it. So I've just actually recomposed the shot now. I'm just going to take a shot and see if it works out any good. Basically focus to infinity. Yeah, I mean, not going to win any awards, but it's a shot. So that's it for this video, and that's it for my little piece on histograms. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have and you'd like to see more of my videos, whether they're kind of this sort of more technical stuff or whether it's just the exploration, taking pictures videos, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you hit the alarm bell as well, that's a notification button. You get a notification every time I put a new video up. Likes, shares and comments are always appreciated. That's it for me. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next video, bye.